In this section, we are discussing about all the questions and the concept of Fetch API. This is a category of asynchronous JavaScript only, and there are only two relative questions to this topic. We have already seen AJAX, that is the concept of AJAX, and also we have gone through the XML HTTP request object. In the newer version of JavaScript, there is a better way to deal with the network requests. And we are going to discuss the same, that is the Fetch API. The Fetch API is a better, faster and more efficient way to deal with HTTP or network requests. XML HTTP request was the object we were using before ES6, but ES6 onwards, now we have the Fetch API. The syntax of the Fetch API looks something like this. For example, you have const response promise is equal to fetch. This is the API. Now the first parameter is URL, which is not optional, and the second one is optional. We call that as init, or you call it as optional object. So here the first parameter URL is nothing but the resource where you want to make the request. The second parameter is optional object literal, and if not given, by default the Fetch API will make a GET request. This optional object can have various keys which are information set with the HTTP call. For example, to make a post request, because as I just mentioned that if you do not have this second parameter mentioned, then it will be a GET request. But let's say you want to make a post request. So to make a post request, this optional object will look something like this, where we have the method where you write the post or whichever request you want to make that you mention here. The headers, where you define the header related information for request, and of course the body where you send the information to the URL. Like the method, headers and body, there are other options, for example mode, cache, redirect, etc. We won't be looking at all the options in this section, but you will come across many of them during this series of tutorials. Let's make an example to get the data. We will use the same JSON placeholder for the API which we used with XML HTTP request object. I will create an asynchronous function. Let's say for example the name is fetch data. I'll say const response is equal to, I'm using the await, and that's the reason why I mentioned async here. Then the fetch statement, which is going to return a response promise in fact. So here I'm going to give the URL. So this is the URL, that is the user's URL where we want to make a request and we want to get the data. Now as I mentioned, this second option we are not giving, right? So this is anyway a GET request. But at the moment what I will do is I will simply display the value of the response object here. I'll say response. Now we are calling the fetch data and we run the code now. So now we have the output here. This is actually the response object, the entire response object itself. So this is the value of response object here. If I just expand this, you will see that there is body. If I click on the body, it says that readable stream. It means if I read the response.body, it will be the data constantly receiving from the server. So it is a chunk by chunk data we receive. Anyway, that's not the concern at the moment. Here we have the headers. We also have a status here, and that is 200. We also have one more, a kind of status, that is OK, which says that it is true. That means everything worked fine and we have received the data also. The reason is we have the status 200. That means it is the successful request. Now, if I just display response.OK, in fact it is already there that it is true. So let's try to display both response.OK and response.status. So you already see here in the object the expanded values where it is showing the OK and 200. So here I'm going to say status and I'm going to run the code. So we have the value of OK and status, that is 200. The concern here is that if the response is OK, that means it was 200, everything was successful, then I would like to show the data. So I will say, for example, I will declare a variable let data, and here I'm going to say data is equal to await the response we received from the server, that is this object, has the data in text format, in JSON format, in binary format. There are various ways. At the moment, the data we have received can be converted directly from JSON to the readable data. So in a way, we are parsing the data using this JSON method. So as you see that I have written await and response.json. So the data will be transferred to this data variable. Now let's try to display this data only. So I will simply say console log data. So this is going to wait. The await will make sure that it waits for the data to retrieve in the first call. In the second call, this is going to be parsed and then we are displaying the data. So let's run this and see how it happens. Now you see that the data is displayed and it is in the object literal format only. In fact, instead of writing JSON, you can also say text. Let me do that. Let's run the code again. Now you see that we have the text data. If you have returned text once, then next line you cannot write response.json because this is the stream which is already read by this response.json or text from body, and the entire chunk of data is stored into data. It's not like a body readable stream where the data is coming in pieces. If you have to deal with images, then instead of writing this text or JSON, you may also write blob as well. Alright, now one more thing I just want to mention here is, this is a kind of lengthier way. Instead of writing this await, you can use simple syntax of promises only. In that case, what we can do, let me just remove all these things. The first thing is that even you do not need this await. Let's say you write the fetch statement directly. Once the fetch is called, it's going to anyway return the promise. So you can say then, right? But I'm going to put a then on a next line. So I'll say then. So I'm chaining, and when the response is received, what I just want is that I will use the response.json. So that's the first thing I want. This will again return a promise which I can handle with another then, where the data will be received and that I'm going to display. I'll say console log data. Now if you compare the earlier code and these three lines, which is actually not terminated even, it's a single line only because it is chaining. So now let's run the code. You're going to get the same output. So instead of writing the code with async await, you can go with this way of code as well. It all depends on what's your program situation and how you are writing the code, how your calls are managed. Depending on that, you can follow the syntax. Anyway, the output is similar, so that doesn't matter. As discussed earlier, the fetch API by default makes a GET request. In case if you want to make a POST request, then the optional object parameter can be used. We already have a specific format on the JSON placeholder where it is going to return success if we add the record properly. So the only thing I will do is I just want to make, let's say, a request to, instead of users, I just want to make a request to another URL called to-dos, right? And here now I want to make a post request. So I'm going to put a comma here and I'll put the object literal. Inside this object literal, the first thing I want is that the method is going to be the post method, then the headers. Here you are going to set the headers. Now I'm going to send the JSON data here. So I'll say content dash type. What is going to be the content type? So it's going to be application JSON, and the character set is going to be UTF-8. That's it. And the next thing, I'm going to set the body, where I'll say JSON dot stringify, and I'll say to do. Now this to do, what is this to do? To do is going to be the data. So here I'm going to define the data also. Let's say const to do. It's an object where I have, let's say, user ID. So I'll say user ID, which is, let's say, 1001. Then this structure is defined by the API programmer, right? So on JSON placeholder, this is what the structure is. So I am following that structure. When you work with your own program, there will be a different way, different fields you will have to enter. And of course, let's say there is one more field completed. Well, I'll say false, true or false, whatever. So this to do is the data, and that data you are passing to body with stringify. After this data, this request is made, the next thing is going to be this only, that is the then response will be there, right? And we just want to see what is the response. So I'll put a console log here, response I want to display, and that's it. I don't want this line now. So this code will make a post request. That means it will add the data. Let's try to run this and see what is the output. So here if you see that status is 201, that means the post request is successfully made. The JSON placeholder is a fake API, so it does not actually add any record, right? But when you have your own APIs, then certainly you can call and modify this method with post, delete, put, patch or whatever. Now in this case, what you see, these headers. These headers are set for the request, or you can say these are the request headers. The way we have request headers, we do also have access to the response headers as well, right? So for example, I just go to the last code which we tried. Now in this code, before the response is received, let's say here, I try to display. In fact, I do not want to display any data now. I do not want to check whether status is okay or not. I just want that I want to display response dot headers, number one. Number two, what I want is headers dot get. Here I'm going to get the direct content type. This we tried with the XML HTTP request as well, right? But here with fetch also it's possible because we have the response header data. So now if I run this, you get the object, headers object, which has the data, of course, if you expand it. And if you directly see the content type, then it is application JSON and character set is UTF-8. As mentioned earlier, the fetch API can also work with images, but that is the discussion for the forthcoming dedicated fetch and image or blob section. So to conclude, the fetch API is a better option to make AJAX or HTTP calls and is a newer way introduced after ES6. Let's discuss relative questions of this topic. The first question is, explain the fetch API functionality. So now you already know that when it comes to making an AJAX call, right, when you want to add data, in short, when you want to perform CRUD operations, then you can use the fetch API. Apart from CRUD operations, when it comes to downloading and uploading files, dealing with the images, various other options you can try with fetch API nowadays. The second question is, how will you make a delete request with fetch API? Well, very simple. Here in this example, you see that the post request is made. Instead of post, what you have to do is you just have to say delete, and that will be a delete request.